Pick up a salt shaker. Look at it. Those tiny white crystals, you probably used them this morning, on your eggs. On your toast, maybe in your coffee if you like it fancy. You use salt without thinking. It costs almost nothing. You can buy a whole box for less than $1. It sits in your kitchen cabinet, ignored, ordinary, boring. But 500 years ago, men killed for salt. Armies marched across deserts searching for it. Empires rose and fell controlling it. If you had salt, you had power. If you didn't have salt, you starved. Your food rotted, your animals died. Your family suffered. Salt was more valuable than gold, more precious than jewels. It built cities, it destroyed kingdoms, it started revolutions. It changed the course of human history. And the word you use every day, the word salary, comes from salt. Roman soldiers were paid in salt. That is how valuable it was. So today, we are going back in time. We are going to discover why something so cheap today was once worth dying for. Why wars were fought over white crystals. Why governments taxed it until people revolted. This is the bloody, surprising, incredible history of salt, and it starts with survival. Before we talk about empires and wars and money, we need to understand something basic. Something that seems simple but changed everything. Salt keeps food from rotting. That is it. That is the secret. That is why salt became the most important substance in human history for thousands of years. Think about life before refrigerators, before freezers, before grocery stores where you can buy fresh food any day of the week. Imagine you are living 3,000 years ago. You hunt an animal, a deer maybe, or you catch fish from a river. You have meat, protein, food that will keep your family alive. But there is a problem, a big problem. Meat rots quickly. In hot weather, meat can spoil in hours. Even in cool weather, it goes bad in days. And when meat rots, it becomes poisonous. Eating rotten meat can kill you, so what do? You have this precious food, you worked hard to get it. But you cannot eat it all at once. You need to save some for tomorrow. For next week, for the winter when hunting is impossible. This is where salt saves you. When you cover meat in salt, something amazing happens. Salt pulls water out of the meat through a process called osmosis. Bacteria and organisms that make food rot need water to survive. Without moisture, they cannot grow. They cannot multiply. They die. No water means no bacteria. No bacteria means no rotting. The meat stays good. For weeks. For months. Sometimes for years if you do it right with enough salt. Suddenly you can store food. You can hunt one animal and feed your family for an entire season. You can survive the winter when hunting becomes nearly impossible. You can travel long distances carrying food that will not spoil along the way. You can build permanent settlements instead of constantly moving to find fresh food. You can plan ahead. You can prepare for hard times. Salt changed everything. It made civilization possible. Without salt, humans would have remained small nomadic groups, always searching for fresh food, always moving with the seasons, always one bad hunt away from starvation. With salt, we could stay in one place. We could grow larger communities. We could specialize in different jobs. We could build cities. We could create culture and art and architecture. We could plan for the future instead of just surviving today. But here's the problem that shaped all of human history. Salt is not everywhere. You cannot just find it anywhere like you can find water or wood or stones. Salt comes from very specific places. The ocean, obviously. Seawater contains about 3% salt. But if you live far from the ocean, hundreds or thousands of miles inland, getting salt is incredibly difficult. Some lucky places have salt mines, underground deposits where ancient seas dried up millions of years ago, leaving behind thick layers of pure salt. Poland had enormous salt mines. Austria had them. Parts of Africa had them. These salt mines became some of the most valuable real estate in the world. Some places have salt springs, where salty water bubbles up from deep underground. Animals discovered these springs first. Deer, elephants, and other animals would travel great distances to lick the salty ground around these springs. Humans followed the animals and discovered the salt. And some places, vast regions of the earth, have nothing, no ocean, no mines, no springs, no salt at all. If you lived in one of those places, you had a serious problem. You needed salt desperately to survive, but you could not get it easily. So you had to trade for it. You had to give up something valuable in exchange. And that is when salt became more than just a mineral. That is when salt became valuable. That is when salt became currency. That is when salt became power. That is when salt became worth fighting for. Worth killing for, worth dying for. Ancient civilizations understood this immediately. They built their entire economies around salt. The Egyptians harvested salt from the Nile Delta, where Mediterranean seawater flooded the land and then evaporated in the intense sun, leaving behind pure white salt crystals. They used it to preserve fish caught in the Nile River. They used it to preserve meat. And they used it in their most sacred ritual, mummification. When a pharaoh died, priests removed the internal organs and packed the body cavity with salt mixed with natron, another type of salt compound. The salt pulled all moisture from the body over 40 days. This preserved the body forever, preparing the pharaoh for the afterlife. Salt was sacred. Salt was life. Salt was eternal. The Chinese developed perhaps the most sophisticated salt production system in the ancient world. They dug deep wells, sometimes hundreds of meters deep, to reach underground saltwater deposits. This was incredibly difficult and dangerous work with ancient tools. Workers dug through solid rock using only primitive drills and their own muscle power. Many died in cave-ins and accidents. But the reward was worth the risk. Once they reached the saltwater, they used bamboo pipes to bring it to the surface. Then they boiled it in massive iron pans over wood fires. The water evaporated. The salt remained. It was hard, exhausting, expensive work. But it was so valuable that the Chinese government created a complete monopoly. Only the government could produce and sell salt. Private citizens were forbidden from making salt. Anyone caught making illegal salt faced brutal punishment. Some were beaten, some had their property confiscated. Some were executed. Think about that for a moment. Execution for making salt. Death for boiling seawater. That is how valuable it was. That is how much control governments wanted over it. The salt monopoly made the Chinese government incredibly wealthy. Some historians estimate that up to half of the government's revenue came from salt taxes during certain dynasties. Half. Salt money built palaces. Salt money funded armies. Salt money paid for the Great Wall. In Europe, salt shaped entire societies and determined which cities became powerful. Salzburg in Austria literally means salt castle or salt city. The city was built next to rich salt mines in the nearby mountains. For over 1,000 years, those mines produced high-quality salt. The archbishops who ruled Salzburg became some of the wealthiest and most powerful religious leaders in Europe. They built magnificent Baroque churches and palaces. They funded musicians and artists. Mozart was born in Salzburg and supported by salt wealth. The beautiful city you can visit today, with its stunning architecture and cultural heritage, was built on salt. Krakow in Poland had similar salt mines. The Wielika salt mine near Krakow has been operating for over 700 years. Miners carved entire chambers and chapels out of the salt deep underground. They created chandeliers made of salt crystals. They carved religious statues from salt. The mine became so beautiful and historically important that today it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Millions of tourists visit it every year. All because of salt. In Africa, salt created one of the most dangerous and profitable trade routes in history. The trans-Saharan salt trade connected North Africa to West Africa across the brutal Sahara Desert. Caravans of camels carried slabs of salt weighing hundreds of pounds from salt mines in the north, from places like Tagaza in modern Mali. The journey took months. The heat was unbearable, sometimes reaching 50 degrees Celsius. Water was scarce. Travelers had to know exactly where the rare oases were located. Sandstorms could bury an entire caravan in minutes. Bandits hid in the desert, waiting to attack and steal the valuable salt. Many men died on these journeys. Their bones marked the route for future caravans. But merchants kept going because the profit was enormous, almost unbelievable. In some West African kingdoms, salt was traded weight for weight with gold. 1 kilogram of salt equaled 1 kilogram of gold. Imagine that, the same weight, salt as valuable as gold. In the legendary city of Timbuktu, salt arriving from the north met gold coming from the south. Merchants from across Africa and the Middle East gathered there to trade. Timbuktu became fabulously wealthy. The city built universities and libraries. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to study there. And it all started with salt, and this is where the roads begin. Not just any roads. Salt roads. Trade routes built specifically to move salt from places that had it to places that desperately needed it. These roads connected civilizations. They spread ideas and languages and religions along with salt. Just like the famous Silk Road carried silk and spices across Asia, salt roads carried the white treasure across continents. One of the oldest and most important was the Via Salaria in Italy. Via Salaria means salt road in Latin. This ancient road, parts of which still exist today, connected Rome to the Adriatic Sea coast where salt was harvested. The road was built over 2,000 years ago. Roman soldiers guarded this road day and night because salt caravans moving along it were constantly attacked by bandits and rival groups. Losing a salt shipment was a disaster, like losing a shipment of gold or weapons. The Via Salaria was so important that the early Roman Republic fought wars to control it. Control the salt road, control Rome's food supply. Control the food supply, control Rome, another major route stretched across the Sahara Desert in Africa. Imagine traveling 800 kilometers across burning desert sand, carrying heavy blocks of salt on the backs of camels. The heat is unbearable during the day. The cold at night is shocking. Water is scarce and precious. You ration every drop. Sandstorms can appear suddenly, blocking out the sun, making it impossible to see where you are going. Some caravans got lost and wandered until their water ran out. Everyone died. But merchants organized these caravans anyway because the profit was worth the terrible risk. A successful journey could make a merchant wealthy for life. Some caravans included hundreds of camels and lasted several months. They created their own mobile communities, traveling together for protection and support. In Germany, there was a salt road connecting the inland salt mines to the Baltic Sea ports. In England, ancient trackways followed routes where salt was transported from coastal areas to inland towns. These were not paved roads like Roman roads. They were just paths worn into the ground by centuries of salt traders walking the same route again and again. But they were important. They connected communities. They created economic relationships. They spread culture and news. Towns grew up along these salt roads. Inns opened to house traveling salt merchants. Markets formed where salt and other goods could be traded. These salt roads helped create the economic networks that eventually became our modern trade systems. The city of Venice is perhaps the most dramatic example of salt creating wealth and power. Venice was built on a lagoon, a shallow area of water separated from the Adriatic Sea. It was a difficult place to build a city. The land was marshy and wet. Buildings had to be constructed on wooden pilings driven deep into the mud. But Venice had one enormous advantage: salt. The Venetian lagoon was perfect for salt production. Seawater would flow into shallow ponds during high tide. Then gates would close, trapping the water. The sun would evaporate the water over weeks, leaving behind pure salt. This process, called solar evaporation, was cheap and efficient. Venice produced enormous quantities of high-quality salt. And then Venice did something brilliant and ruthless. They created a complete monopoly. Venice controlled not just their own salt production, but also the salt trade throughout the northern Adriatic Sea. They forced other salt producers in the region to sell only through Venice. They set the prices. They controlled the supply. If you lived anywhere in northern Italy, Austria, or Central Europe and needed salt, you had to buy it from Venice. You had no choice. This monopoly made Venice unbelievably wealthy. The city became one of the great powers of medieval Europe. Venetian merchant families built palaces along the Grand Canal. They competed to construct the most beautiful buildings. They funded artists like Titian, Tintoretto, and Bellini. They commissioned magnificent churches decorated with gold and precious stones. They built a vast trading fleet of ships. They controlled trade routes throughout the Mediterranean. All from salt. The Venetian government was so protective of their salt monopoly that they passed strict laws to maintain it. Competing salt producers were shut down, sometimes violently. Ships carrying unauthorized salt were seized. The cargo was confiscated. The ship owners faced heavy fines or prison. Venice sent inspectors to make sure nobody was cheating the monopoly. This system lasted for centuries. Venice's power lasted from the medieval period through the Renaissance. And salt was the foundation of it all. But controlling salt meant more than wealth. It meant political power. It meant the ability to control entire populations, because here is the fundamental truth about salt. Everyone needs it: rich people, poor people, kings and peasants, merchants and farmers. You cannot survive long without adequate salt. Your body needs sodium to function properly. Your heart needs it to beat. Your muscles need it to move. Your nerves need it to send signals. Without enough salt, you get weak, you get confused. You get sick. In extreme cases, you can die. So if a government controlled the salt supply, they controlled the people. They controlled something absolutely essential. And governments across the world quickly realized they could tax salt. They could force people to pay for something they absolutely needed to survive. And that is when salt became truly bloody. That is when the anger started building. That is when revolutions began. In France, the salt tax was called the gabelle. It started in the 13th century as a way for the king to raise money. At first, it was a simple tax on salt sales. But over centuries, it became more and more oppressive. Eventually, the gabelle forced every French citizen over the age of 8 to buy a certain minimum amount of salt every year from government-approved dealers. You had to buy it whether you needed it or not, whether you could afford it or not. You had to buy it even if you were poor, even if your family was starving. The price was set artificially high by the government, much higher than the actual cost of producing salt. The difference went straight to the king's treasury. The government made enormous profits. They used the money to fund wars, build palaces, and support the aristocracy. Meanwhile, ordinary people struggled to pay. For a poor farming family, the gabelle could consume a significant portion of their yearly income. They paid for salt they might not even want or need. They watched their children go hungry because they had to spend money on salt instead of food. And if you tried to avoid the tax, if you bought salt from anyone other than the official government dealers, or if you tried to make your own salt by evaporating seawater, you were committing a serious crime. The punishment was brutal and shocking. Some people were sent to work in galleys, the large rowing ships. They were chained to oars and forced to row for years. The work was exhausting and often deadly. Some people were branded with hot irons as punishment. Some had their property confiscated. Some were executed. Entire families were destroyed because they could not afford the salt tax or because they tried to evade it. Salt smuggling became a major illegal industry. Brave or desperate people would sneak salt across regional boundaries where tax rates were different, or they would gather salt secretly from the ocean. But the government hunted these smugglers relentlessly. Thousands were arrested every year. The prisons filled with salt criminals. The gabelle created enormous resentment among the French people. It built up over generations. Parents told their children about the unfairness. The anger passed from one generation to the next. And this resentment was one of the major causes of the French Revolution in 1789. The French people had many complaints against their king. Heavy taxes, food shortages, political oppression. But the salt tax was a perfect symbol of everything wrong with the system. It was a tax on something essential, something everyone needed. It helped the rich and hurt the poor. When the revolutionaries stormed the Bastille prison in Paris on July 14, 1789, marking the beginning of the revolution, many of the prisoners they freed were there for salt crimes. For trying to avoid the salt tax, for smuggling salt, for making illegal salt. These were not murderers or thieves. They were ordinary people who could not afford an unfair tax. The revolutionaries saw them as victims, as symbols of oppression. The anger over salt was real. It was deep. It had built up over 500 years. And when the revolution finally succeeded, when the king was overthrown, one of the very first things the new government did was abolish the gabelle. The salt tax was gone. People could buy salt wherever they wanted. They could make their own salt if they wished. Salt, which had been a symbol of royal oppression for so long, became a symbol of freedom and the power of the people. But this was not just a French problem. Other countries had similar oppressive salt taxes that created similar anger. England had a salt tax that people resented. Spain taxed salt. Even in the newly independent United States, there were debates about whether to tax salt. But perhaps the most dramatic salt tax conflict happened in India under British colonial rule. And that story would eventually help bring down the British Empire. In 1930, India was controlled by the British Empire. Britain ruled India as a colony, taking resources and wealth while giving little back to the Indian people. The British government had created a law, the Salt Act, that said Indians could not collect or sell salt. Only the British government could produce salt. Only the British government could sell it. and they charged high prices and imposed heavy taxes on it. This law was especially cruel, almost deliberately insulting, because India has a very long coastline, over 7,000 kilometers of coast. Salt is literally everywhere. The sea is full of it. Indians could see salt. They could taste it in the spray. They could smell it in the ocean breeze. But they were forbidden by law to gather it. If they simply bent down and collected salt from the beach, they were arrested. They faced fines or imprisonment. This law made the British government extremely wealthy. The salt tax and salt monopoly brought millions of pounds into British coffers. But it made the Indian people poor and angry. Many Indians struggled to afford salt. They struggled to preserve food. They struggled to stay healthy. They watched British officials get rich while their own families suffered. And they resented being told they could not use a natural resource that surrounded them on all sides. Mohandas Gandhi, the leader of India's independence movement, understood that this salt monopoly was a perfect symbol of British oppression. It was simple enough that everyone could understand it. It was universal enough that everyone felt the injustice. Rich and poor, Hindu and Muslim, North and South, everyone needed salt. Everyone suffered under the monopoly. So Gandhi decided to break the salt law publicly and dramatically. He announced that he would walk from his ashram to the sea, a distance of about 387 kilometers, and he would make salt from seawater. It sounds almost silly. Walking to make salt. Such a simple, small act. But it was revolutionary. It challenged British authority directly. It invited mass participation. Anyone could walk, anyone could make salt. Gandhi began his famous Salt March on March 12, 1930. He was 61 years old, not young, not particularly strong, but determined. He walked with a long wooden staff to help him on the rough roads. He wore simple white homespun cloth that he had woven himself. And he walked slowly, deliberately, stopping in villages along the way to talk to people. He explained why he was walking. He explained why the salt law was unjust. He invited people to join him. Thousands joined. Then tens of thousands. By the time he reached the coastal town of Dandi on April 6, 24 days after starting, the crowd following him was enormous. Some estimates say 70,000 people walked at least part of the way with him. Journalists from around the world were there. Photographers and newsreel camera operators captured everything. The British government watched nervously. They were not sure what to do. Arrest an old man for walking? That would make them look cruel. Let him break the law? That would show weakness. They decided to wait and see. And what did Gandhi do when he reached the ocean early in the morning? He performed a ritual bath. He prayed. Then he bent down and picked up a small lump of natural salt that had formed from evaporated seawater on the beach. He held it up in his hand so everyone could see, and he smiled. That simple act, picking up salt from the beach, broke British law. And it started a revolution. Across India, millions of people began making their own salt. They went to the ocean and collected it. They boiled seawater in pots and pans. They openly defied the British government. Women joined the movement in huge numbers, something unusual for the time. They organized salt-making events in their villages. The British responded with violence and arrests. They arrested over 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. They beat peaceful protesters with wooden clubs called ladis. One famous incident happened at Tharasana Salt Works. Protesters marched peacefully toward a government salt facility. British-commanded police beat them brutally. Many protesters were seriously injured. Some died, but they did not fight back. They practiced non-violent resistance just as Gandhi had taught them. The world watched in horror. Newspapers printed photos and stories. Public opinion turned against Britain. How could a civilized nation beat peaceful people for making salt? The Salt March and the protests that followed became a major turning point in India's fight for independence. It showed the world that British rule in India was unjust and cruel. It energized the independence movement. It proved that nonviolent resistance could work. And 17 years later, in 1947, India finally became independent. Historians often point to the Salt March as one of the key moments that made independence possible. All because of salt. All because one old man walked to the sea and picked up a white crystal. The story of salt and war does not end with peaceful protest. Salt has been a strategic military resource throughout history. Armies need salt for the same reason everyone needs it. To preserve food. An army marched on its stomach, as Napoleon famously said. Soldiers need to eat. And when armies are moving through enemy territory or fighting far from home, they cannot rely on fresh food supplies. They need preserved food, salted meat, salted fish. Without salt, army food supplies rot. Soldiers go hungry. Hungry soldiers cannot fight. They become weak and sick. They desert. So controlling salt supplies can determine the outcome of wars. During the American Civil War in the 1860s, salt became a critical strategic resource that both sides desperately needed. The Confederacy, the southern states fighting for independence, had a serious problem. Most of the salt production facilities were in the north or on the coast. When the Union Navy blockaded southern ports, salt shipments stopped arriving. The South had to quickly develop its own salt production. They built salt works along the coast where they evaporated seawater. But the Union knew how important these facilities were. Union armies specifically targeted salt works. They sent raiding parties to destroy them. They burned the buildings. They smashed the equipment. They filled the salt pans with dirt. One Confederate soldier wrote in his diary, "We can do without many things. We cannot do without salt. Without salt, meat rotted before it could reach the troops." Food supplies became unreliable. Soldiers' health deteriorated. Some historians argue that the lack of adequate salt contributed significantly to the South's eventual defeat. Even in World War II, salt production facilities were considered strategic targets. Both Allied and Axis forces bombed enemy salt works to disrupt food supplies. In occupied territories, resistance fighters would sometimes sabotage salt production to hurt the enemy's food logistics. Salt remained important even in the 20th century because while refrigeration existed, it was not available on battlefields or in military camps. Armies still relied heavily on salted preserved foods. This military importance of salt goes back thousands of years. Roman armies were supplied with salt as part of their standard rations. The salarium, the salt allowance, was as important as weapons or armor. Chinese armies fighting in distant provinces needed constant salt supplies. Supply lines carrying salt were heavily guarded. Losing those supplies could mean losing the war. But perhaps the most famous salt-related conflict, as we discussed, was not a war with guns and soldiers and death. It was a peaceful march, a protest. One man walking with a stick, wearing simple white cloth, leading thousands of followers on a long journey to the sea. Gandhi's Salt March proved that salt could be more powerful as a symbol than as a commodity. The march was brilliant because it turned something simple, something everyone understood, into a powerful political statement. Every person in India could relate to the injustice of the salt tax. Every person could participate in making salt. It was democratic. It was accessible. It was peaceful, and it worked. The British Empire, which had ruled India with military force for nearly 200 years, could not stop people from picking up salt. They could arrest protesters. They could beat them. But they could not stop the idea. The idea that the salt tax was unjust. The idea that Indians deserve freedom. Salt became the spark that lit the fire of independence. Today, salt is everywhere. It is so common that we barely notice it. We use it without thinking. We waste it without guilt. A box of salt costs less than a cup of coffee. You can buy more salt than a medieval king could afford for pocket change. The substance that once caused wars, that built empires, that started revolutions, is now essentially free. We dump it on roads in winter to melt ice. We throw it away if it gets damp. The price has collapsed so dramatically that salt has become nearly worthless economically. Technology changed everything. In the 20th century, we developed better mining techniques to extract salt from underground deposits. We built huge evaporation facilities that can produce thousands of tons of salt efficiently. We learned to purify salt to remove impurities. Most importantly, we invented refrigeration and freezing. Suddenly, we did not need salt to preserve food anymore. We could keep meat fresh in a refrigerator for days. We could freeze it for months. We could transport food in refrigerated trucks and ships. Salt was no longer essential for survival. It was no longer the difference between eating and starving. It became just a seasoning, just a way to make food taste better. The value disappeared almost overnight in historical terms. But here is the ironic twist that nobody expected. Now we have the opposite problem. We use too much salt. For all of human history, humans struggled to get enough salt. We fought wars over it. We walked hundreds of miles to trade for it. We paid enormous prices for it. But today the problem is not too little salt, it is too much. Food companies discovered that salt makes everything taste better. It enhances flavor. It makes us crave more. So they started adding salt to everything: bread, cheese, canned soup, frozen dinners, breakfast cereal. Even sweet foods sometimes contain added salt. The average person in a developed country now consumes far more salt than their body needs. We eat 2 or 3 times the recommended amount. And this excess salt causes serious health problems: high blood pressure, heart disease, strokes, kidney damage. Millions of people die every year from conditions made worse or caused by eating too much salt. So now, instead of governments forcing people to buy salt like the French gabelle, governments are trying to make people eat less salt. Public health campaigns warn about the dangers of too much sodium. Food labels are required to list salt content clearly. Doctors tell their patients to reduce salt intake. Some countries have imposed taxes on high-salt foods to discourage consumption. It is the complete opposite of history, the exact reverse. For 10,000 years, from the beginning of civilization until the mid-20th century, humans fought desperately to get enough salt. Now we fight desperately to eat less of it. The thing that meant survival now threatens it. That transformation tells us something profound about how quickly the world can change. About how solutions can become problems. About how scarcity can turn into excess in a single lifetime. The story of salt is really a perfect microcosm of human history. It shows our ingenuity and our cruelty, our cooperation and our conflict, our ability to create systems and our tendency to abuse them. For most of human history, salt was essential and scarce. That combination made it valuable. And valuable things attract human attention, human desire, and human violence. People who controlled salt became powerful, they became wealthy, they built empires. They funded art and culture. They shaped civilization. But they also exploited others. They created unfair monopolies. They imposed cruel taxes. They used their power to oppress. The history of salt contains both the best and worst of human nature. It also shows us how connected everything is. Salt shaped where cities were built. Rome grew partly because of access to the Via Salaria. Salzburg exists because of nearby salt mines. Timbuktu became a center of learning because of the salt trade. Salt-shaped economies. Entire industries existed just to mine, produce, transport, and sell salt. Thousands of people made their living from salt. It shaped politics and government. Kings and emperors spent enormous energy controlling salt supplies and salt taxes. Revolutions started over salt. Independence movements used salt as a rallying symbol. It shaped warfare and military strategy. Generals worried about salt supplies as much as weapons and soldiers. It shaped culture and religion and language. Salt appears in religious rituals and sacred texts. We have sayings and idioms based on salt. Worth your salt. Salt of the earth. Take it with a grain of salt. These phrases echo a time when salt was precious. When salt mattered. When salt was power. And that is what makes the story of salt so fascinating and important to remember. It reminds us that the ordinary objects around us have extraordinary histories. That the simple things we ignore every day were once worth dying for. That the world we live in, this world of abundance and ease, is not normal. It is not natural. It is the result of thousands of years of human effort, struggle, innovation, and sacrifice. Our ancestors fought for salt. They walked across deserts for it. They mined in dangerous conditions for it. They paid crushing taxes for it. They went to prison for it. They sometimes died for it. And now we casually sprinkle it on our food and throw away what we do not use. That gap between then and now is staggering. It shows how much has changed. How far we have come. How different our world is from the world of just a few generations ago. When you reach for a salt shaker, when you sprinkle those white crystals on your food without thinking, you are participating in a tradition that goes back to the very beginning of civilization. You are using a substance that built empires and destroyed them. That made fortunes and ruined lives. That started wars and ended them. That caused revolutions and enabled civilizations. Every grain of salt carries history. Every crystal contains stories of human ambition, suffering, ingenuity, creativity, cruelty, and survival. The Roman soldier receiving his salarium. The African merchant crossing the Sahara with salt slabs. Their struggles, their dreams, their victories and defeats, all preserved in salt, like food preserved for the future. And perhaps that is the real lesson we should take from the history of salt. That ordinary things are not ordinary at all. That the simple objects we ignore and take for granted every day have extraordinary stories if we take the time to look. That the world around us is the result of countless people working, fighting, suffering, innovating, and sometimes dying so that we can have what we have. That abundance is not natural or guaranteed. That cheap is not the normal state of things. That ease and convenience are actually the result of enormous effort across generations. Salt teaches us to pay attention, to ask questions, to wonder about the origins of things, to appreciate what we have, to remember the past, to understand that history is not just about kings and wars and great events. It is also about everyday objects, about the things people needed to survive, about how those needs shaped society and culture and politics and economics. The history of salt is really the history of humanity. Our need for it drove us to explore, to trade, to build networks of exchange, to create economic systems, to develop technologies, to organize governments, to fight wars, to start revolutions, to seek justice. The whole human journey is there in salt. From desperate survival to comfortable abundance. From scarcity to excess, from too little to too much. From fighting to get it to fighting to avoid it. From sacred to common. From valuable to worthless. From killing for it to throwing it away. That transformation, that journey, tells us who we are and how far we have come. And maybe, just maybe, it reminds us to be grateful. Not for salt specifically, though we should appreciate it, but for the world we live in. A world where basic needs are met, where food does not rot, where we do not have to walk 400 kilometers to protest an unjust law, where we can take for granted things that our ancestors would have considered miracles. That is the gift of history. It gives us perspective. It helps us appreciate. It connects us to the past. It reminds us that we stand on the shoulders of billions of people who came before us, who struggled so we could have ease, who suffered so we could have comfort, who died so we could live. So the next time you see a salt shaker, stop for a moment. Really look at it. Those tiny, ordinary, boring white crystals. Think about the Roman soldier. Think about the French revolutionary. Think about Gandhi walking to the sea. Think about the African merchant crossing the desert. Think about the Chinese miner deep underground. Think about the Confederate soldier desperate for salt. Think about the Indian protester making salt on the beach. Think about the child whose family could not afford the salt tax. They are all there. In that simple, cheap, ordinary, extraordinary substance. Salt, the white gold, the bloody treasure, the mineral that built civilization and almost destroyed it. The crystal that connects you to 10,000 years of human history. The substance that people died for and that we now ignore. That is the real story of salt. The whole human story. And now you know it. And now you will never look at salt the same way again.